welcome to one more edition of Politics and Rant. I'm Egberto Willis, your host. Thank you so kindly for being with us. Look, folks, will COVID-19 unite or divide our society? America's social capital, that is, how individuals and groups work together or don't to create or inhibit corporation. The answer to those questions will have much to say about how we survive today and build a better tomorrow. How will we live together? How will we seek truth and sort through bias, communicate and find common ground, balance individual and societal priorities, and take responsibility for ourselves and be our brothers and sisters' keeper? Here to discuss these important issues is Mac Regan, author of the new book, The 2020 American Revolution, 2020 Decision Support for Voters. Mac Regan, welcome to Politics Done Right. It is my pleasure to have you here with us.
Well, it's my pleasure to be on this morning. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. You know, before we get deep into the issues, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I had a 35-year career in management consulting. I ran a variety of businesses within that consulting, both in the healthcare area. Then I ran in the human capital practice, the job evaluation compensation practices, and I ran a global human capital business prior to my retirement several years ago. Since then, I've been spending all my time researching and writing about citizenship. And so my first book, Global Citizen Patriots, came out in 2016 in preparation for the election then. And earlier this year, my new book, 2020 American Revolution, came out really as a voter support guide for the 2020 election. This is going to be a really contentious and difficult election, and voters need support, and they need to know how to ask the right questions.
Well, I mean, that is so true. One of the things that got to me most importantly was the piece that you wrote. And the questions are, we are now in the doldrums. The economy, for all practical purposes, have crashed. The question is, how do we rebuild from there? And I think a lot of people think about waiting for, okay, we have recovered, now we can think about doing what we need to do. I think what you wrote is more important. We need to start thinking during this crash so that we start rebuilding the processes, both societal and otherwise, to move forward. And you say to that.
That's exactly right, Egberto. And I would supplement that by saying that this is complex. I mean, we have a lot of issues to deal with. We have gross inequality, we have poverty, child poverty, we have a healthcare system that's ranked 43rd in the world. We have all kinds of social media and media dysfunction right now. Our media right now is weaponized by the right and the left, both sides, frankly, in a way that doesn't serve the majority of citizens in the country who are moderate, frankly, are more moderate than the tails. You know, the parties are not helpful. They exist to win elections, not serve us. And think about all the issues relative to climate, all the issues relative to our faulty infrastructure, all of the issues relative to wealth and income inequality. These are really complex, deep issues. So my theory of the book is to really have voters think about these issues not as solution 1 and solution 2 and solution 3, but let's ask the candidates the right questions that force the candidates to give us a response on those issues that are important. And I've divided the book into sort of an economic capital evaluation. So we have political capital, and we have social capital, we have financial capital, we have built capital, which is infrastructure. We have the most important thing, human capital. You know, people are number one, right? But we don't often treat them that way in terms of how we deal with things like the coronavirus and how we deal with pay levels continuing and jobs continuing. And we don't have a good social network for healthcare. So we have a lot of issues, and the ability of voters to sort through that is going to say lots about the way our future goes, the way our democracy goes. And social capital is one of those things that really is difficult for people. Everybody has their own biases. I have my biases. You have your biases. I would call those beliefs some days, but other people would call them something else.
Let me tell you, the reason I want to stop you right there is because I want to take this in the direction of a paper you wrote, which we'll be publishing at our site as well. And I think it's important because before we get to these solutions, we have to learn how to communicate with folks. We need to learn how to communicate in a manner where people have respect for each other, irrespective of their beliefs, irrespective of all of these things. And here's what you wrote a paper titled Improving Social Capital in the Age of Disease, Disinformation, and Distrust. And I think that hits the nail on the head. You separated that paper into 5 different things that we had to do. And, I am a former, I am still a board member of the Coffee Party, where we discuss a whole lot of civility and how do we have civil conversations. And in looking at these 5 items, I sat down and I said, we could have pasted that in just about every tenet that we have within our structure. So let's go ahead and discuss that. Avoid characterizations such as liberal, conservative, etc. Why don't you expand on that?
Exactly. Well, thank you for kind comments about the article. I mean, just to define social capital for your listeners, social capital I define as an asset when it helps us build consensus, trust, and reciprocity. But on the converse of that, it becomes a liability when it creates distrust, a lack of cooperation and division. So what I've suggested in the article is there are ways to think about this as an individual. We can't solve all the dysfunction in the media, at least overnight. But each individual and as a community of voters, we can think about really 5 different things here that might help us get to thinking about social capital in a more collaborative, in a more trustful manner. So the first thing I come up with is really, let's avoid characterizations such as liberal, conservative, nationalist, Democrat, Republican, whether you're a Christian, whether you're agnostic, whatever it is. Let's recognize that really no one single group has all the right answers. We need to work with all those groups. So you need to look beyond that. People need to think beyond that. And the second thing that
before you go to the second, because I love that. I love that. When I saw that in the paper that you wrote, I was a bit disappointed for one part. I wanted you to expand a little bit more on that section. How in our polarized society, a society with that is bipartisan as opposed to, let's say, many different parties, how do we do that? How do we start to try to talk to folk and say, well, let's drop that I'm a Republican, let's drop that I'm a Democrat, let's just talk these issues? How do you first make that approach to convince somebody to vote against your own culture many times?
Well, I think the answer relies on the fact that look what we've gotten for government with the polarized method, the social distrust, where the Republicans are fighting the Democrats every day. What one says is automatically anathema to what the other thinks. And that is a formula for sure failure politically. So if you, for example, on the far right, just basically are going to believe everything the far right says, or if you're on the far left and you believe everything the far left has. I mean, look when the Obama administration had control of both houses of Congress and the presidency, they put through the Affordable Care Act. Now, I might like the Affordable Care Act because I think we need to deal with our health insurance here, but the Republicans hated it. The fact that they were unable to work together to a better health care solution caused the Republicans, as soon as they got control of Congress and the presidency, to try to repeal it. At the same time, the Republicans, when they got complete power during the, when they had both houses of Congress, and when they had, they put in the tax reform that really, all it did was serve to increase inequality. So I would tell you that compromise and trust and the ability to talk amongst each other is where most Americans are. If you look at the breakdown of American voters, really there's only about 10% on each tail that is far right and far left. Now, there are people that are more conservative than not. There are people that are more liberal than not. But the majority of Americans, 2/3, according to the statistics I cite in the book, are moderate. So if you can come up with a candidate who can serve both masters and do it in a moderate way, I think there's an audience out there that will be more trustful and ready to vote for those moderate candidates.
Okay, let's go to the second item because I think you kind of stepped on a number 4, but let's go ahead and do the second one.
Yeah, the second thing is that all of us, but particularly the media and we as individuals, need to commit to truth. Where there's no truth, there is no trust.
Right.
And right now we have a truth problem. So we need to verify as individuals, don't blindly trust the sources that are well-regarded fact checkers, and expose yourself to a range of media sources. So right now, you have folks who only listen to right-wing news. We have people that only listen to the more liberal news. Well, you know what? We need to balance that. People need to get both sources. In the book, I suggest sources that I think are balanced and present both sides of the story. NPR is a good example of that. But not everything has. So if you read the New York Times, it has a liberal sort of sway, right? If you read the Wall Street Journal, it has a more conservative sway. But both sources are good sources in terms of they try to tell the truth. They have professional journalists writing the articles, and there's a sort of standard that they exist. So you may not agree with the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times on a daily basis, but if you read both, you get a little balance in your life.
Let me ask you something. As far as truth is concerned, there are certain truths that are absolute, and there are certain things, I won't call them truths, things that are that have some sort of gray in it. How do you determine? How do you fight an issue when we're dealing with absolute truths versus this is my opinion about something?
Yeah, two thoughts on that. One, in the book, I would say that American truths are often related to our constitutional values. So all men are created equal, right? We do a lousy job of executing that historically, but the reality is that is a value that we all hold, and it is a central truth that we all theoretically believe. So the things in the Constitution, like that, the things in the Gettysburg Address, all of those documents that reflect our historical values are a great starting place to get to truth. The other part of truth is, facts and checking facts. And, it goes beyond our constitutional values. So facts relative to climate change, facts relative to the fact that we have a very poor healthcare system that nobody believes that we actually have. We're 43rd in the world in healthcare in terms of not having coverage. But people widely regard our healthcare system as one of the best in the world. It is not. It's one of the worst in that it doesn't cover people, and it has quality shortcomings as well as quantity shortcomings. So getting to those facts requires asking yourself some tough questions, going to those different sources that I referred to, trying to balance that information. This is really hard stuff for most people. It requires an introspection and a look into yourself and a willingness to take other opinions that is really hard to do.
Now, let me tell you something. From the time that I read your bio, etc., it was evident to me that you are somebody on the moderate side of the aisle, if you will, somebody that is very moderate. You kind of see things down the middle. I find it. I think it is important for us to understand, and you tell me if I'm right or wrong. Just like there are, let's say, liberals and there are conservatives, that moderates are also a point of view.
No, I think moderates are a point of view. I would characterize myself as a social liberal and a financial conservative, for instance.
I figured that.
Yeah,
Your management.
I think that would be a fair characterization. and where I stand on climate change. I'm a believer in climate change. I'm a believer that we need to do something. So everybody has their own opinions on these, but how you attack each one of those issues, whether it be climate change or financial inequality or child poverty or our poor infrastructure, those require solutions. People and candidates are required to come up with solutions. They are required to have realistic solutions. So coming up with a solution that the other party won't buy, or the majority of Americans won't buy, or coming up with solutions that are nothing but lies to make political capital are not the way we need to go. So we need to call out lying, and we don't do a good job of that. I mean, some of the media calls out. I mean, the president has a list of 15,000 pieces of misinformation. Yes. Now, maybe his heart's in the right place on some of this stuff, and maybe it isn't. But the reality is, it's the media's duty to call that out, and it's his supporters need to acknowledge that's a problem and try to persuade his constituents, his members of Congress, that that's a way to lose the election.
Interestingly, number 3, recognize the information bias starts from within, because I think that plays a part into what you just said. His constituents need to be able to realize certain things. Where does recognizing that information bias exists sort of play into that?
Yeah, well, information bias for all of us starts within. We all come from, different cultures. We're of different races and ethnicities. We have different religious beliefs. We have different levels of education. We have different levels of experience in terms of who we've been dealing with and who we work with. We have, we come from a whole lot of different things. That's part of the beauty of America and part of the promise of America. But right now, that's dividing us, and we're not harnessing it to full advantage. So we have to understand those confirmation biases. We have to understand where people are coming from, and not just automatically assume that we are right and they are wrong, because you're never right all the time. They are never right all the time. I work with a number of people in business from around the world historically. I also work with a number of people in our town here, from the fire department to the mayor, and people really have different. They're not trustful of each other. But when they sit down and actually talk amongst each other, you'd be amazed what happens. People start trading facts. They start trading information. And all of a sudden, the person who's next to you doesn't look green or white or black anymore. The person looks like you. And, we all have similar problems. We all don't want child poverty. We all want better health care. We all want better wages. We all want to develop our human capital. So I think there is common ground. But you got to sit down and talk about it.
Mac, that is your magic statement right there, because I've found that in my own activities with people. I'm a pretty liberal guy who live in a very conservative area, and the folks that I hang with around here when we're talking and having coffee are mostly conservatives. And that last statement that you made is so true. By the time you're done with the conversation, and I think that is the respect that some folks like us, I think, get, is by the time why you can speak to many people from different modales, if you will, is once people see the honesty, the truth within your convictions or whatever, suddenly you can have a conversation. And not only a conversation, but you can also change minds.
Well, you mentioned the word respect, and that's what it's all about.
Yes.
When you sit down and talk to people about your views, you may still not disagree and you may agree to disagree, but you respect the person's opinion and you've heard the person's opinion. That person knows he or she is being heard. There are projects right now ongoing in the United States that get voters together from a variety, a cross-section of voters, economic groups, different religious groups, different ethnicities, sit them down in a room for a couple of days with a facilitator, and they go through, here are some questions and issues, and the amazing thing, and what comes out at the end of those sessions is often people gain an understanding of what others are thinking, and that understanding is the platform that allows them to reach compromise, and that's what we need in this country.
Now, in the fourth item, you talk about how support candidates who offer specific plans and changes. I want to tie that into something that that we've been talking about, and that is when you talk about the differences among people, but whenever they sit down and find out the things that they have in common, it is so much more. The interesting thing that I find is that what our leaders do is they monopolize on differences. They accentuate the differences in order to keep dissension and get what a certain or select few want in this country as opposed to what most of us want. Would you agree with that? And does that kind of fit into what we're talking about?
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Our representatives in Congress, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, are so influenced by two things: money, the campaign contributions, primarily lobbyist contributions, number one. And number two, they're very influenced by what they would call their constituency. So their constituency is more and more a hardcore group of voters on the right and the left who are always going to show up at the polls because they're really ideologically committed to their point of view. That leaves the middle out. So when the politicians concentrate on their funders, who are often the wealthy and also large businesses who are looking for favors, they're not serving the public. When the representatives concentrate on just a fragment of the electorate, because that electorate might represent 20%, but that 20% is going to show up at the polls every time. They over-focus on that group and ignore the people and don't incent the other people to get to the votes. So I think there are ways to get people to I'm working on an op-ed now that basically says, we ought to pay people to vote. We got a $2.2 billion, bailout, right?
Right.
How about bailing out our democracy by sending everybody who votes a $100 check?
I want to see, when you write that op-ed, you send it to me so I could post that as well, because I really want to see how you're going to put that together. I am all ears. I am all ready to listen. But I want to touch on something here, because you talk about the middle. I don't know if you see some of the stuff that I've written, but I don't particularly like the word middle, because I think you've already said something that we both agree on 100%, and that is, if you put us all together, what you find out is most of the stuff that we are all aspiring for are pretty darn the same. And I hate calling that the middle, because the middle kind of have a tendency to believe like there are left-wing policies that are no good or right-wing policies. And let me give an example. I am sure that Mac Regan wants to be able to go to any doctor that he wants to see and be able to not come out bankrupt out of that office. That is a reality for us all. The question is, well, how do we get there? We have to figure out ideology versus practicality and reality. And I bet if you and I were to sit down, we could come out and say, well, these are what the numbers say, and this is a preferred way to do it based on those numbers. Forget about it.
Yeah, I think you're right. The word middle is probably not the right word. I would say the word is moderate.
I'm going to have to learn.
In all things, moderation, they say, right?
Yes, that's true. That is a true statement. I may have to learn to like the word moderate because, I think they've so conflated moderate and middle. I may have to learn to do that. But after talking to you and loving what you've had to write thus far, I think I may consider the word moderate. I probably will. Anyway, let's go. Let's talk about increased shared faith across diverse communities, because in as much as you put that number 5, right? Yep. I kind of likely would have liked it to be number 1, just because of what the politicians do to separate people on all these different isms.
Yeah, I think whether it's number 1 or number 5, I don't know. I think people will make their own decision on that. But excuse me.
Bless you.
The way to get people to work together more is to create what I would call shared faith.
Right.
In other words, we have to share in the solutions. We have to share in the questions, and whether it's education access, which right now is very uneven. So in my old town, we had a very good school, funded at about $20,000 per student from the local tax base. 2 miles away, we had not a very good school that was funded by a tax base in the next town that was getting students $12,000 per student. Now, is that a fair deal? Both are public schools, but there's a huge difference between a student getting $20,000 a year and a student getting $12,000 a year. So the ability to talk through that, I think most Americans would agree, hey, that's not fair. So how do we orchestrate that? Do we change the tax base? Do we make it more of a broad tax base? Do we share across borders? So this type of conversation on education access, on housing access, on socially diverse networking are ways to promote actions that create broader understanding and thereby create better social cohesion. So, for example, we have a number of institutions now that do a really good job at social cohesion. Let's take the military, for instance. You go into the military after high school, that's a very diverse, you get everything in the military. And as a result, you're forced to, in a team environment, sometimes involving life and death, to put your trust and your reciprocity in the hands of other people. That is a great example of, the military is by its very nature incredibly diverse, and that, it would be nice if we could use employment practices at businesses. My old business was a global business. Half of our employees were outside of the United States. So until I was able to work with people from outside the world, outside of the United States, I didn't have that perspective that you get by dealing with a Japanese national or a German national or a Russian national. They have different perspectives on life. The ability to understand those perspectives and work with those people is a skill, but it also involves incredible understanding. And the key to that is the ability to see their problems more clearly. You got to listen to them. The ability to debate. So you might have a firm opinion that is more or less based on facts. They may have the facts more right or more wrong than you think. But the point is, debate helps resolve those questions. It helps us see our problems more clearly. And I mentioned some of the efforts that have been funded by universities and others to bring diverse groups together. I think we ought to make that part of our democracy. We ought to regularly do that in the states, in the localities, bring people together, have them discuss these issues. It might cost us a few dollars, but what's the price of democracy, right?
Absolutely. Now, I want to get a little bit off subject because you brought it up, and I want to expand on it a little bit because I've spoken about this a whole lot. You just said something about the school, let's say school districts. Adjacent school district, because they have different tax bases, one group may get $12,000 per student, another get $20,000 per student. My answer to that is simple, really, and that is the tax base should be for the entire darn country, if you will, and every student get the same access to education. That would be my solution. However, what that means is that that place that was getting $20,000 likely does not get $20,000 anymore. One of the biggest problems in America is for those who have had the privilege of having the most. When we start to speak about everybody having equal access to success where there is a limited sized pie, it means those who were used to getting more may have to do with a little bit less. How do you handle that issue?
Well, I think you handle it over time. These issues are not, you can't turn on a switch and change where we are right now. But I think you can have a plan that over time changes the tax base from a real estate appraisal tax base to a public funding tax base. So the folks in that town that are paying $20,000 per student may continue to pay $20,000 a student, but at least some of that money needs to go into the public funding. That school also gets state and federal money because it's a public school in addition to the tax base. So maybe they could be relieved of some of the state and federal tax base, saying you already have enough per student. That money that goes into the public trough could then be used to beef up the other schools. The other idea that I think would fester some more social integration is, let's integrate the schools a little bit more. Let's take students from one school and move them to another school. This school that gets $20,000 had very little diversity. That was part of the reason I moved my daughters to a different school at some point, because, having experienced the benefits of diversity, it seemed to me that just wasn't, once you got out of elementary school, it wasn't going to serve them well in the long run. But that type of diversity is not readily available. So moving students across different schools is another way to build social capital, build cooperation, build trust, and build understanding. So I think you can only do that over a period of time. This is, as I said, not a switch you can turn off. It's sort of like our healthcare system. You can't Bernie Sanders it overnight. You're going to have to deal with 1 million, people who work in the health insurance industry who might be out of a job if Medicare for All comes through. Well, you need a way to find them new jobs. You need to train them for new skills. And I think if you could convince them that you could get them better jobs and more meaningful jobs than they have right now, they might be more receptive to.
I am glad I'm glad you brought that up, because, by the way, that is in the bill for retraining of the people who would lose their job as far as Medicare for All is concerned. But let me tell you what I'm most impressed with this interview. Somebody who sees that you are from management, etc., would have the opinion that a lot of the ideas that you have, and even some that I scanned in your book, wouldn't be the ideas that you would come out with. And even when we discuss the school issue that we've just discussed here, some of these innovative ideas as well, I think these are important issues. Now, I'm a bit more, simple, if you will, with solutions, and that is, my thing is everybody just gets the same amount for the schools. But I mean, you talk about transition, and I understand that. I think we're coming to the close of this interview, but I think one of the most important reasons for reading your book, and I haven't read it completely other than scanning, is many Americans that need to hear this. You are able to. I'm talking about Mac Regan here, is able to express it in a manner that a lot of folks who otherwise wouldn't understand these issues are going to understand them. When I saw the piece that you wrote, that is what I got out of who you were as an author. So please give me some final words and tell us how to go about getting your book. And if you want to give a quick synopsis of your book, let's go ahead and do that.
Well, thank you very much for those kind comments. I appreciate it. The book is really designed. It's only 80 pages long. It's highlighted. So if you're a millennial, like my two daughters, and you don't read, or you don't want to read, you can just read the highlights and probably get through it in 2 or 3 hours. But the way the book sets up is by stating some facts. So we are 43rd in the world in healthcare. We have 15% child poverty, even though we're the richest country in the world. Our public education system is very uneven, and that shows up in test scores versus others. These are facts, all right? Our infrastructure gets a D+ in our annual engineering report. That's a fact. Our climate is changing. Our water systems, if you live in Flint and you're drinking out of plastic bottles and you have no opportunity probably in the future to drink out of anything but plastic bottles, and that poor water has harmed 10,000 children irretrievably. And as we have created a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico through dumping chemicals into the Mississippi River, these are all facts, and the book outlines all these facts. So I've set the book up in a way where we have problems. I don't know all the solutions, but I think voters need to be aware of the problems. They need to be aware of the facts. They can dispute the facts all they want. I put the sources in there, and good for them to dig into it and figure out what they agree with and what they don't agree with. But the facts are there as I see them. I think they're compelling. And let's not try to boil the ocean here and come up with it. Every voter needs to have every solution. But every voter needs to know what those problems are, and they need to prioritize them in their own mind and ask the candidates the questions that will get to the points that they think are most important. So it's about questions and it's about problems. And I hope most voters will be able to get through 80 pages and show up a little bit more informed and mostly just show up.
Excellent. I'll index to your book. Mac Regan, author of The 2020 American Revolution, 2020 Decision Support for Voters. Thank you so kindly for having been on Politics Done Right, and I hope to hear from you. And I want that other op-ed on paying the voter.
I'm working on it. I'll send it to you first thing.
Absolutely.
Hey, Garo, thank you. It's been a privilege to be on. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.